Jaden Ross, 16 years old, sat silently in the first-class lounge of Denver International Airport. He wore a charcoal hoodie, jeans, clean white sneakers, and a pair of headphones covering his ears. Beside him sat Mrs. Lorraine, the housekeeper who had been with his family for over 13 years, more like a second mother than a staff member. Jaden was no stranger to flying. He had traveled the world on his father's private jets. But today was different. This was his first time flying without his parents, just Lorraine by his side, and a first-class ticket bearing the name Jaden Elijah Ross, booked by his father himself. In the small backpack at his feet, Jaden carried a handwritten letter from his father, Nathaniel Ross, a black billionaire and the CEO of Nova Air. He hadn't opened it yet. He planned to read it once the plane was in the air. At the boarding gate, when the agent confirmed their names and seats, Lorraine smiled and gently placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "Ready, young master?" Jaden nodded quietly. Inside the first-class cabin, everything was calm and luxurious. Spacious seats, soft lighting, the scent of fresh leather, and smooth jazz playing in the background. Jaden sat in seat 1A, by the window. Lorraine took the seat next to him, 1B. He removed his headphones, planning to watch a movie and enjoy dinner like an adult. But before he could settle in, a storm rolled in, quiet, sharp, and uninvited. Her name was Celeste Dawson. Dressed sharply in her flight attendant uniform, bright red lipstick, hair tied high, eyes cold and judgmental. The moment she saw Jaden, she stopped. Her eyes flicked to Lorraine, then locked on Jaden, with blatant suspicion. "Excuse me, this is the first-class cabin," she said, her voice crisp, like reciting a regulation. Lorraine raised an eyebrow, calmly presenting their boarding passes. "We're aware. These are our seats, 1A and 1B. Celeste glanced at the tickets for barely a second, then replied curtly, "I'll have to ask you to return to the back. There may be a system error." Jaden looked up, trying to remain calm. He spoke softly. "This is my seat. I haven't done anything wrong." Celeste looked at him like he'd just insulted her. "Are you talking back to me?" her voice rising. And then, before anyone could stop her, she slapped him. The sharp crack echoed through the quiet cabin. A passenger dropped their coffee. A woman gasped and covered her mouth. Lorraine froze in disbelief. Jaden didn't cry. He sat still, hands resting on his lap, eyes wide open. A red mark began to bloom on his cheek. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone and typed a single line, "She hit me. Seat 1A, J." Less than a minute later, the screen lit up with a reply from his father, "Don't move. I'm on that plane." Jaden looked around. At the far end of the cabin, a tall man in a black suit rose to his feet. Calm, commanding, eyes cold as steel behind a pair of tinted glasses. His father, Nathaniel Ross. The man Celeste had just assaulted his son in front of, without knowing who he was. The entire first-class cabin fell into a stunned silence, as if someone had hit the mute button. Jaden sat upright next to Lorraine, whose face now reflected a mix of anguish and fury. That slap, it wasn't just an act of aggression. It was a collapse, a breaking point, a mask torn off under the lights of reality. Jaden didn't cry. He stayed silent, hands trembling as he opened his phone and typed to the one person who would listen. "She hit me. First class." Lorraine leaned closer, her touch both gentle and fierce. She stood and walked straight toward the cockpit. "I need to speak to the captain, now." But while others stared into overhead bins or pretended not to notice, one man was already moving. From seat 4A, Nathaniel Ross, tall, composed, shoes polished like obsidian, stepped into the aisle. No one knew he was on that flight. No one expected the CEO of the entire airline to be calmly seated among them, and more importantly, no one knew he was Jaden's father. Nathaniel approached, his gaze fixed on Celeste, who was still clutching a tray of drinks like nothing had happened. "You just slapped my son," Nathaniel said, his voice low, every word slicing like a blade. A faint sound chimed. Someone had just started recording. Celeste stammered, I didn't know he was your son. You didn't know he was my son? Or you didn't think a black child belonged in first class, so you thought you could hit him in front of everyone?" Celeste's mouth dried, her hands clenched. Nathaniel turned to another flight attendant. "Contact the captain. Tell them Nathaniel Ross is making a direct request." Just minutes later, he received a call on the cabin phone. His voice remained calm. "I'm requesting that Celeste be immediately relieved of all in-flight duties. She is not to interact with any passengers. Security will be waiting upon landing. Celeste wavered. She had served hundreds of flights. Never once had a passenger complained, let alone the chairman of the entire airline. Jaden watched his father from a distance. He still hadn't spoken a word, but something in his eyes had changed, a shift tied to a new belief. Sometimes, all it takes is silence and standing your ground, and the world will have no choice but to see you. The silence in the first-class cabin was no longer about avoidance. It had become heavy. A middle-aged woman in seat 2D lowered her glass of wine and whispered to her husband, "Can you believe this is actually happening?" The man nodded, face blank, eyes fixed on Celeste, who stood stiff at the rear of the cabin like a ghost in uniform. A young passenger, live streaming her flight out of habit for TikTok, had caught most of the scene. Celeste slapping Jaden and Nathaniel's chilling response. Within minutes, the clip began spreading across social media. On another passenger's phone, a notification popped up. Shash Seat 1A is trending on Twitter. Celeste stood frozen next to the beverage cart, unable to take her eyes off Nathaniel. She had never been named like that, so coldly, so publicly. She had never been stripped of her authority like this, and especially not at 35,000 feet in the air. The captain emerged from the cockpit. He saw Celeste. He saw Nathaniel. He didn't need an explanation. He turned to a younger flight attendant and nodded. "Escort her to the crew quarters, immediately." Celeste walked away. Her steps were heavy as lead. Some passengers quietly raised their phones. No one cheered. No one clapped. But the way every pair of eyes followed her out, wordless, weighty, was a sentence no courtroom could issue. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Not because Nathaniel had raised his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of silence, timed, precise, wielded by a father who refused to stay quiet any longer, shook everything. Jaden remained seated, eyes fixed ahead. Lorraine gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Jaden nodded. But the real answer was, no, not yet. But this time he wasn't alone. The plane continued cruising, but something fundamental had changed on board, not just for one boy, but for everyone who had witnessed the truth unfold. When the aircraft finally touched down, the tension inside was still palpable. No excited chatter, no rush to grab overhead luggage, only stares, toward Jaden, toward Nathaniel, and toward the empty spot where Celeste once stood. Nathaniel didn't move. He sat still, hand on the armrest, gaze straight ahead, as if awaiting a verdict that had already been rendered. Jaden stayed silent too, but his hands had stopped shaking. The aircraft door opened. 3 security officers and a senior airline executive stood waiting at the exit. No one needed directions. They stepped aboard with solemn respect, but also with authority. One whispered to the lead attendant. Another quietly reviewed the manifest. When Celeste's name was called, no one was surprised. She was led out, not in handcuffs, but under the kind of gaze that said, "This time, it won't be swept behind the crew curtain." Brenda, no, Lorraine, leaned in close to Jaden. "Don't look back, baby." Jaden nodded, but his eyes glanced back, not to see Celeste, but to make sure it was real. And this time, he wasn't dreaming of someone standing up for him, because that person was sitting right beside him. Passengers began deplaning. A few nodded at Jaden in quiet solidarity. One placed a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." No one mentioned the slap, but everyone had seen it, and no one would forget it. At the final doorway of the jet bridge, just before stepping into the terminal, a reporter with a press badge raised his camera. "Mr. Ross, could you comment on what happened during the flight?" Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply turned to Jaden, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and walked forward. No words, no reaction. But the world had already started writing the story. This time, based on the truth. The media didn't wait for permission. Within hours of landing, the video of Celeste slapping Jaden topped YouTube. On Twitter, Seat 1A exploded. But this time, not out of spectacle, out of solidarity. To prove that justice doesn't have to scream, it just needs someone brave enough to face the truth. Nathaniel sat in his office at Nova Air headquarters. Behind him, a glass wall revealed the city bathed in sunset light. His phone rang nonstop. He didn't answer. On the screen in front of him, the board of directors appeared on a Zoom call. "Have you all seen the video?" he began. Everyone nodded. A black child was slapped in front of paying passengers by someone tasked with ensuring their safety and dignity. We're handling it, the PR director offered. No, Nathaniel's voice cut through. We don't handle this. We change it. He placed a document on the desk. The Jaden Ross policy. Starting next week, all flight crews will undergo mandatory training in unconscious bias, soft power, and emergency passenger relations, especially with minors. That video will be shown in the first session. No one objected. No one could. Because this time, a child had taught them a lesson. Not with rage, but with a silence that refused to be ignored. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the window blinds, casting a warm golden hue across the Ross family kitchen. Jaden sat at the breakfast table, stirring a glass of milk slowly, eyes fixed on a small folded note in his hand, the one his father had slipped into his backpack before the flight. You don't need to speak loudly to be heard. Truth echoes when you stand firm. Lorraine entered, carrying a tray of toast. She set it down gently in front of him. Did you sleep okay, sweetheart? Jaden gave a small nod. Not quite peace, but a beginning. Outside, the world was in an uproar over the video. The school, the media, social networks. Everyone was talking about the boy who was slapped in seat 1A. But here, in this quiet kitchen, everything was still. His father entered next, wearing a crisp white shirt buttoned neatly, but his face showed signs of a long, sleepless night. He looked at Jaden, then sat across from him. Are you okay? He asked. Jaden was quiet for a few seconds, then whispered, I don't know. Nathaniel nodded. That's okay. You don't have to know everything right now. Jaden looked at him, voice choked. I was just sitting there, and they still treated me like I did something wrong. Nathaniel's gaze softened. He leaned in and placed a hand on Jaden's. That's because many people out there still haven't learned how to truly see. But yesterday, you taught them something important, that the silence of dignity speaks louder than any prejudice. The phone rang. This time, Nathaniel answered. It was the president's office, a senior advisor requesting permission to use the incident as a national case study on racial bias and conduct in the service industry. Nathaniel responded calmly, do what's right. But remember, this isn't about a brand, it's about my son. After the call, he turned back to Jaden. Do you want to take a few days off school? Let things settle down? Jaden shook his head. No, I want to go. I don't want anyone thinking I'm afraid. Lorraine smiled, not the smile of a housekeeper, but the smile of a mother. Then let me grab your coat. It's cold today. And that morning, the boy who had been slapped so hard it left a mark, walked out of his house without trembling. Not because he forgot, but because he understood. That sometimes the strongest response to an insult is not to bow your head. The gates of Roosevelt High open like any other morning. But today, the air felt different. Jaden stepped out of the car, backpack slung over one shoulder, blue hoodie pulled over his head, eyes fixed forward, like it was a silent marathon. Groups of students lingered by the trees, phones in hand. They had seen the video. Some glanced at him, some looked away. But then his classmate Andre approached. No smirk, no sarcasm, just a hand on Jaden's shoulder and a quiet sentence. What happened? Wasn't right. But you stood your ground, and we saw it. Jaden nodded. Didn't say a word, but his eyes said thank you. In class, Miss Ellis, their homeroom teacher, paused mid-lesson. The room turned to look at Jaden. But she didn't call on him. She didn't single him out. Instead, she rested her hand on the teacher's desk and looked at the class. Before we begin today's lesson, I want to remind everyone, this is a classroom, and everyone sitting here matters, not because of their skin color, their clothes, or what their parents do, but because you each deserve respect. Jaden inhaled deeply. She never mentioned the incident, but every word she spoke felt like invisible armor across his shoulders. At lunch, while many huddled around phones replaying the video, Jaden walked to the reading room. There, he checked his phone and saw a message from an unknown number. I was one of the passengers who stayed silent on that flight. I saw everything, and I should have spoken up. I'm sorry. Jaden didn't reply, but he saved the message. Because he now knew. His silence, firm and steady, had stirred something even in those who once refused to move. Elsewhere, in a 25th floor conference room at the airline's headquarters, Nathaniel Ross sat quietly during this special presentation. The new head of training stood at the front, outlining the contents of the airline's newest initiative, the Bias Reflection Curriculum, a core part of the new protocol named after his son, the Jaden program. The manager closed with a sentence that echoed through the room. Not because he's the chairman's son, but because he did what most adults are too afraid to do. He stood still when insulted, and made an entire system bow its head and take a hard look in the mirror. Nathaniel didn't speak. He simply nodded. There was no need for speeches, no press releases. True change begins in silence, the same way Jaden had begun. That night, in his small bedroom covered in airplane sketches and model jets, Jaden sat carefully gluing the broken wing of an old toy plane. Lorraine walked in, carrying a mug of hot cocoa. "Still thinking about it?" she asked. Jaden nodded. "Do you think she regrets it?" he asked softly. Lorraine sat beside him. "I don't know, but what matters isn't whether she regrets it. What matters is that you didn't let that pain define who you are." Jaden looked up at her. His eyes carried a maturity he didn't have a month ago. "I don't want to be famous. I just want to be seen for who I am, not for my skin." Lorraine squeezed his hand gently. "And because you dared to be yourself, other kids might not have to go through the same. You changed something." Outside, the city lights flickered like 1,000 stars, but inside that room, a quiet fire was burning. The fire of a new generation that refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. One Sunday afternoon, the corporate tower of Ross Airways was unusually quiet. But on the top floor, lights remained on in a private conference room. No press, no slogans. Just a meeting between the executive board and a group of special guests. The passengers from the flight that changed everything. Nathaniel Ross stood. No speech, no script. He looked each of them in the eye, then said, "You were not just witnesses. You were the beginning. Because the silence of a child, my son, forced all of us to ask the question, where are we really going?" No one spoke. All eyes turned to the screen behind him, where the first lines of a new code appeared, now officially implemented across the entire airline, the Jaden Protocol. Every passenger is a person. Every seat is a recognized right. Every flight is a chance to do what's right. At school, Jaden was preparing for a short talk during his civics class. Miss Ellis had asked if he would be willing to share his story with younger students, as a lesson about human dignity and self-worth. Jaden wore a white button-up shirt, holding a small note with a few bullet points. But when he stood in front of the class, he folded the paper. He didn't need it. "Sometimes you don't need to do anything," Jaden said. "You just need to not run away from who you are." The room went still. A younger student, dark-skinned with braided hair, raised his hand. "If someone disrespects me, what should I do?" Jaden paused for a moment, then answered, "Don't let yourself fall. Then look around. Someone will stand up for you. Or you'll be the first to stand up for yourself." Later that day, when Jaden returned home, he found an envelope placed neatly on the table. It read, "From the Flight Crew Training Division." Inside was a letter. Not long, not poetic. "We used your story in this week's training. Some were uncomfortable, some cried, but no one looked away. You taught us what no textbook could. Thank you, Jaden Ross, from those who once thought they were never wrong." Jaden folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a memory box in the corner of his room. Then he opened his notebook and for the first time in weeks, wrote a single line. "I don't need people to know who I am to treat me right. I just need them to remember I'm human." At Los Angeles International Airport, a new poster had just been placed above the first-class check-in counter. It wasn't an ad, it wasn't a model's face, it was a photo of an empty seat. On the headrest were the words, "Seat 1A, a place where everyone deserves to sit, to be respected, and to be heard." Beneath it, in small print, the Jaden Ross Initiative. No one was forced to read it, but everyone who passed by stopped. Because sometimes the most powerful voice doesn't come from a scream, but from a silence too deep to ignore. This story didn't end when the plane landed. It began, and the journey of Jaden, a boy who just wanted to sit quietly, moved an entire industry. If you've ever felt unseen or unheard, remember, you are not alone. And sometimes, simply holding your seat is enough to change the course of the whole flight. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment, share the video, and don't forget to follow Aiva Stories to help spread more stories that change lives.